When did you first see it?
Out the door of a helicopter. We were flying low over the jungle when suddenly the trees just stopped and we were over this dead area that stretched for miles. I asked the commander on board what it was, and he just said ranch hand.
Okay, what did that mean?
Well, I later found out that this was an army operation to clear the forest with the objective of making the Viet Cong visible to American bombers. To do this, they used a combination of defoliant chemicals, bombs, napalm, and huge armored plows to take down all the trees and undergrowth. We flew over the area for half an hour, and I was totally mesmerized. I had never seen anything like it before.
At this point, how long had you been in Vietnam?
A month. I had been writing for the AP. I was carrying my camera around, but I hadn't started using it yet.
And did you do any filming on this trip?
No, but I could start to see a film taking shape. I made arrangements to go visit a clearance unit out at Hobo Woods, where about 20 men were stationed. To start, I just spent a few days watching, getting to know the procedure. The way it would work was 4 or 5 bulldozers would drive in a row, and pretty much everything would come down. The plows had a thick steel blade at the front, so they could go through a big tree like it was nothing. After 2 or 3 hours, you'd have a patch of cleared ground, maybe 100 yards square, and they'd burn off whatever was left with diesel fuel. At a certain point, I had the idea to attach my camera to one of the bulldozers and shoot very physical, mechanical footage of the process as it progressed.
And what did the soldiers think about you doing this filming?
They were very positive. Their day-to-day job was quite difficult and was often dangerous, and I think the filming relieved their boredom, so they got involved. They even welded together a mount so I could attach the camera to different parts of the machine. I filmed for about a week, climbing up and loading the camera whenever the bulldozers would stop. I'd set the camera going, and the bulldozers would drive while I waited on the ground. To start, I made a few shots looking up into the forest canopy. I was trying to capture the moment when the trees would come down and the light would suddenly pour in. Then I started to use a simple pattern. Do one shot looking forward, one to the side, one behind, one down, one up, then I'd repeat it again. So I wanted to place the camera at the center of this radical transformation. Because usually jungle was dark, damp, and very loud. Insects buzzing, birds, monkeys. After the clouds came through, all that was left was sky and scorched flat earth. It was very bright and hot and strangely silent. Nothing moved. The soldiers called it the desert.
And so after that, you came back to Saigon.
That's right. I was still writing for the AP. This would have been, I think, late 1967.
Were you still going out into the field?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Into combat zones?
Sometimes, although the fighting was never a very strong interest, so I filmed very little of it. I was starting to gravitate toward footage which explored the war as a process of erasure or negation. I was really looking at situations that said something about that. I was shooting some landscapes, the aftermath of battles, other things. I filmed in a village called Cam Son that had been forcibly evacuated by the army and which had become a ghost town. There were pots left on cooking fires, piles of grain waiting to be put in baskets. After I finished filming, all the buildings were brought down and burned. In between my trips out into the rest of the country, I was working in Saigon, doing several stories a week for the AP. On my days off, I started to shoot more and develop a structure for the film. I had collected some photographs of the war and had a few taped to my wall. One was a photo taken at distance of a Viet Cong fighter. There was a picture of a Marine looking into a Viet Cong tunnel. One of former President Diem's ruined palace after his overthrow. What else? I had a picture I'd taken at Hobo Woods after the trees had been taken down, a few others. It occurred to me that I could use these in the film. So I had them blown up into big photostats. I borrowed some lights and spent an afternoon filming. And then after that, this would have been, I think, early January 1968, the Viet Cong assaulted cities all over South Vietnam without warning.
The Tet Offensive.
And that's right. For us, it was just chaos, and Saigon was really in a panic. The American embassy had been briefly taken over. There was fighting in the streets, the airport was closed. People were really scared. Nobody knew what was going on. There was an Australian journalist who lived in my building, Kate Jones, and we decided together to go out the next day and have a look around. We left our place very early the next morning, and the streets were empty, very quiet, although you could hear an occasional gunshot in the distance. We were just looking around, trying to take it in. Before we really understood what was happening, this young man ran out of a side street and was thrown to the ground. It took me a second to realize that he'd been shot. So I looked around and saw a group of South Vietnamese soldiers who'd fanned out in the street. They're the ones who'd shot him. We were about 20 yards away, crouching as quietly as we could behind some trash. After a few minutes, a truck drove up. His body was thrown in the back. The soldiers climbed in and drove away. We were told later by the police that he was Viet Cong, although we couldn't confirm that. Just as quickly as it had happened, the street was empty again. I took out my camera and started filming just a series of short shots marking where each of the men had been standing. A fence, a patch of paving, an iron railing. I remember the man died under a tree, and I wondered if the soil was black from his blood or from the rain the night before.
And how were you affected by the offensive?
Well, I was pretty shaken up, like everyone. Starting out in Vietnam, I was young enough to feel like I would somehow avoid getting hurt or killed. Now Saigon was no longer the oasis we maybe thought it was, and we all felt vulnerable. The fighting was really intensifying across the country, so most of the correspondents were following combat. That's where most of the stories were getting written, most of the film was being shot. Everything else was getting ignored, or it became low priority. So I decided to really focus on the war's impact on civilians. That's what I wanted to know about. And these stories were easy to get, so that's what I did. I spoke frequently with a young Vietnamese woman named Tran Nguyen. She was about my age and was involved in a number of pro-democratic pressure groups who were protesting the South Vietnamese regime.
Were you writing stories about her?
No, I didn't write directly about her, as I didn't want to cause her problems with the government. But she was the conduit for a number of stories, or a series of reports about politics within South Vietnam, as well as an article about the war's impact on Vietnamese civilians I wrote for a magazine.
How did she figure in the film?
There is a story she told me about her grandparents that stuck with me, so I asked her to repeat it. Now, my camera couldn't record synchronized sound, so I decided to record the interview on audio tape, and then I shot a small amount of footage of Leanne as a kind of portrait while we spoke. The story was that her grandparents had owned a small farm in the southern delta. They raised animals and produced rice and were modestly successful. At a certain point, the government ordered them to leave their land and move to a small house in Saigon. This was part of a program to remove civilians from certain areas so that the army could more easily find Viet Cong. So, of course, they hated the house. It was small, dark, there was no place to plant anything, and right away there were problems. Strange sounds in the night, rattling furniture. They would come home to find all the food in the kitchen spilled out onto the floor. Finally, one morning, Leanne's grandfather came downstairs to find a pair of legs sticking out of the wall, kicking back and forth. He ran outside to see the top half of an old man emerging from the brickwork. The man, or apparition, whatever it was moving his mouth like he was trying to talk, but no sound came out. So Leanne's grandfather was terrified, so he ran back inside. When her grandmother came out, the old man had disappeared. They were convinced that the house was haunted by something or someone that wanted them gone, and so they moved out later that day. Afterwards, Leanne took me to see the wall, and I shot some film of its surface.
Do you know what happened to her?
About a year after I left, Leanne and several of her relatives moved to Seattle and started a new life. We kept in touch, and I've visited her.
Do you still have her interview?
I still have some of her footage, but the audio was lost, so I don't have her voice. Now, I'm considering interviewing her again for the new film.
Okay. Maybe now's a good time to talk about the film's history.
Sure.
When you came back to Portland in the summer of 1968, part of the footage was lost, is that right?
Yeah, I was shipping all my negatives back, and one of the boxes disappeared.
And at this point, they were unprocessed, so you hadn't seen them?
No, I hadn't seen anything I'd shot.
What was your response?
I decided to abandon the film, as painful as that was to do.
Why abandon it?
I'd lost 2/3 of my footage, including the material I filmed with the bulldozers. So I just processed the negatives and put them on a shelf. About a year ago, I decided to dig them out and make a print so I could have a look.
And what prompted that to start using the material now?
I would return to thinking about the film, about Vietnam. It's never been far from my mind. And partly I was just curious.
How did you feel seeing it for the first time?
Oh, all kinds of things. Some very personal. I was 25 when I shot this, so just being transported to that moment is powerful for me. What's left over is very fragmented. I've had to throw out all my original ideas for the film, which involved a lot of cutting between different sections.
Where do you see it going now?
Well, that's what I'm trying to understand. What we'll see in a minute is everything that's left. It hasn't been edited. I'm looking at it this week and making notes, thinking about how I can shape it. Right now I'm considering leaving parts of it more or less as they are.
Are there any surprises?
Oh yeah, I've forgotten a lot. There's a camera experiment I don't remember shooting at all, and I don't know what my intentions were in doing that. Maybe the biggest surprise is a section that was shot by someone else, a young Marine named Lewis. He had been a source on a few stories about military life. One day he knocked on my door and told me he needed a place to stay. He was going back to America the next week, but didn't have any money. As it happened, I was due to fly out to Pleiku for several days, so I told him he could use my apartment. And he was gentle and a little spaced out, and I thought he was maybe deserting, but I didn't ask. When I came back, my apartment looked untouched, except for his boots placed neatly next to the door. About a week later, I realized that he'd shot a roll of footage on my camera, which I kept loaded in a drawer. It was just a series of shots of my apartment. Some flowers, my couch, a picture of me taped to the wall. At one point, he filmed his own hand. It's a self-portrait, really. What else is there? Let me think. There's a role that I thought I had lost, part of the footage I'd shot in the jungle. Towards the end of my time with the bulldozer crew, they came up to a steep embankment that was too difficult for the machines to handle. So they decided to break and call in the bombers to work the area the next day. The bombs are actually so powerful they could level a small hill. So they said I could climb into this patch of jungle and do some filming. For an hour, I went in and shot footage of the forest. There were huge, thick palms, giant leaves, all kinds of birds and insects. It was a really beautiful place. The next day was bombed flat. It was, what can I say? I found it very moving to see that again. So I thought that now would be a good point to show you the footage.
Okay.
We can have a look, and if you have any more questions, we can go over them afterwards.
Okay, sure.